The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing, of restoration, and of hope.
But educate a girl, and you educate her entire family.
There is a sun within every person.
When that anger sets in, write it. Write the letters, but don't send them. You never want to leave concrete proof of insanity.
My name is Giles Gunn, and it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this panel discussion this afternoon. Our distinguished participants will be introduced in a moment by my colleague, Professor Susan Derwin, but before she does, I would like to take just a moment to reflect on why we are all here. We're meeting today as part of a two-quarter project designed to look at the utilization of torture as it is now authorized and practiced by the United States government, and to consider its future. The United States has permitted and authorized the use of torture for centuries, since it was an indispensable instrument of intimidation, control, and humiliation in the coercion and extermination of Native Americans and the maintenance and reinforcement of the heinous aspects of the slave system in the American South. Torture has also long since become routine and acceptable in the perpetuation and vast extension of the United States prison system, where we currently incarcerate over 2 million individuals and keep another 4 million or more under surveillance. It has been a covert, if not overt, instrument of policy, not only in Latin America from the early 20th century, where we trained whole cadres of Latin American military officers and troops in its techniques and practiced it ourselves in places like Nicaragua to terrorize Nicaraguans and defeat the anti-imperialist forces of folks like Augusto Cesar Sandinista, and was also extensively employed throughout the Cold War, and particularly in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, where prisoners, as many of us remember, were kept in tiger cages without food and water, physically abused in numerous ways, including suffering baths in lye. But in response to the so-called war on terror, the United States has now extended its use of torture in various innovative ways. From the practice of extraordinary rendition, where terrorism suspects are shipped by the United States to countries such as Egypt, Uzbekistan, and Yemen, who are slightly less squeamish about the commission of acts of torture than we are, and the network of CIA prisons in various European and Asian countries, to the creation of those notorious places of prisoning that stretch from Guantanamo in Cuba to Abu Ghraib in Iraq to Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan and beyond. Here, prisoners have been held for 5 years without charges or representation, abused with systematic, indeed with, as it's proudly described, sometimes scientific regularity. The authorization of the use of torture by the American government is not restricted to the employment of pain to extract information. Under the procedures associated with what is now called psychological as opposed to physical torture, it is used to degrade, humiliate, and destroy both the individual who is being interrogated and often the members of his or her community who care about and feel connected to the victim of such inhuman treatment. The only restrictions on the methods to be employed is that they must not exceed the pain associated with the breakdown of entire bodily systems. To anyone who has witnessed this terrible spectacle personally, in the presence of a dying person, this kind of pain is well nigh unimaginable. That these practices represent a violation of former legal standards in the United States and a betrayal of various American ethical and legal traditions are well-known facts. What is less well known, or at least understood, and what the project to which this afternoon's panel will be a significant contribution, is the impact that this new legitimation and normalization of the use of torture has had on several of our most valued institutions in the United States. In this project, those of us who have organized it have identified 4 such institutions that have been brought into radical question by the administrative licensing and public naturalization of the use of torture. But no doubt, there are many more. The first such institution is the institution of democracy itself, which is situated at the very center of America's imagination of itself, and is crucial not just to this country's global ambitions, insofar as there remains any consensus about this, but to its global credibility. The second institution is the American Academy, and particularly its university system, which has played an important role not only in condoning conceptions of others that support or reinforce such abuses, not often or always intentionally, but has also in some cases actually collaborated in the refinement as well as the supervision of torture itself. The third institution is the media, print, visual, digital, even auditory, which has helped create a cultural climate where the practice of torture has become both tolerable and forgettable. The fourth institution is associated with the past, and most especially with America's heritage, which has lent itself, often regrettably, to being rewritten or reinterpreted in a way that glosses its own potential as a justification or explanation of such practices. Having identified these institutions among others, however, I want to say that our object in this project is to explore the extent to which the humanities, as a discipline, as a subject matter, as an ideal, and most especially as a mode of critical reflection, can be used to illumine their complicity in such practices, the complicity of these institutions. When the photographs detailing prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib were released in May of 2004, the cultural critic Susan Sontag stated bluntly that these photographs are us. What did she mean by such a claim? How is this assertion to be understood? What would it matter if she were right? How would we have to change if we believed her? These are some of the questions we will be pursuing here and elsewhere during the course of this project.
Anyone who knows me, certainly my friends and definitely my students, know that I can turn any conversation to the topic of torture at any time with anyone. But being invited to actually speak about torture is a nice change. I wanted to just maybe very briefly start out with why and how I got interested in the topic of torture. I mean, it emerged out of my first major research project, which was my doctoral dissertation and then the book on the Israeli military court system in the West Bank and Gaza. And one of the very first months while I was living in Israel-Palestine, going off for one of the very first visits to an Israeli military court in Hebron, I was there to observe what were called extension of detention hearings, when prisoners are brought for the first time after being arrested to a judge who then decides whether or not they can continue to be held or would be released. And so that day we saw a parade of prisoners coming through. All of them were sent back to prison, were, basically because of the fact that they had not yet confessed, and at the request of the Israeli security services, they would continue to be interrogated, the point being to get them to confess. Well, one of the people that we saw that day, or I saw that day, stood out even when he was just walking in and out of the building as someone who seemed so very alive. And as it happened, that night he died in interrogation. And it left a very big impression on me. And then over the next, his name was Mustafa Akawi. And I write about him in the prologue of my book. But it was a sense of just seeing someone dying, who had died like literally within the span of hours after myself having seen him, made me, attuned me to, in a sense, to the very human issues of security and self-determination and all of the things that go into the struggles that take place in Israel-Palestine over Palestinian independence and the end of occupation and so on. But over the 2 years I was living there, and then, the many more years continuing to work on my book, I came really to understand something that I hadn't known when I went there as a young graduate student, which was the importance of law. And one of the things I realized about law was something that I often try to share with my students in Law and Society, that law will not set you free, but the law is incredibly important because it serves as an instrument for us to be able to judge the world and to act on the world. And so both agents of states and those who resist, state abuses and other practices will use the law. And so the law, in a sense, functions as a double-edged sword. And in the context of Israel-Palestine, we saw very intensely not only the way in which Israeli government officials would interpret the law to essentially legalize torture during the late 80s and 1990s, but also the way in which those lawyers, Jewish Israelis, Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza would also use the law to try and push back, to try and defend the rights of their clients and to protect them from, the abuses that they would undergo, especially in interrogation. And so it was, in a sense, that experience of learning both how the law could be interpreted by a state that prides itself on being a state, Israel, a state that's a democracy and committed to the rule of law, and yet, is engaging in military occupation and also legalizing torture, and also how lawyers and others could, in a sense, engage these issues with the law. And so when 9/11 occurred, I was actually driving across country from Morehouse College, where I was teaching, to take my job here. And that was, literally I was in Arizona on my way here when 9/11 occurred. And in a sense, my first sort of entree onto the scene at UCSB was an event organized immediately after 9/11 to just help the community, the campus come together. And I realized, very early on that many of the things that had characterized what I knew about law and war and violence, security and terrorism, etc., in Israel-Palestine were very quickly becoming characteristics of what happens in the United States, or what is happening now, including the ways in which many lawyers who are trying to defend the rule of law are pushing back against state agents who are seeking to legalize torture. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but let me just say a few things about torture itself and torture and the law, especially if we're dealing with, the post-World War II era. And I tend to be, as again, my students would know this, as a hardcore legal positivist, in the sense that law, rights come from laws and laws come from people, and the laws that created human rights are the products of developments after World War II. So human rights have a very short history, really literally only less than 60 years. And in this post-World War II era, torture has emerged as one of, or the right not to be tortured is considered one of the fundamental human rights. But I would actually say, and there's a basis for interpreting the law to say that the right not to be tortured is the first among equals in terms of human rights. Now, we could also say that self-determination in another way functions as the first among equals, but if you think about torture, the way it operates, torture, the right not to be tortured applies to all people everywhere, always, regardless of their race, their gender, their nationality, regardless of anything they have done or are accused or suspected of doing. Other kinds of human rights, for example, the right not to be genocidally exterminated, depends on the intent of the exterminators. If, for example, you're killed for political rather than ethnic or national or racial reasons, you're not technically being genocidally exterminated. This is the way the law operates. And the way in which, sort of war crimes, the interpretations of those things. But torture is a crime that is criminalized both in war and peace, and as I said, it applies to all people everywhere. And so in that sense, one of the things that teaching and learning about torture is particularly useful, it helps us think about human beings, states, and law. In a sense, the dynamics among those three things. And when it comes to the laws governing torture, if there is absolutely no basis upon which someone can be tortured, that means that no state has a right to torture. And for that reason, then that is one of the most important, in my opinion, and significant limits on states' rights. In a world where states still dominate the international system and where politics can be very, favoring powerful states, etc., if we at least think about law and torture and states' rights in that sense, this is one area where the state has no right to torture. And arguably, it is because of the strength of the law and the strength of the right not to be tortured that the fact that the U.S. government has been engaging in torture. This may not be the worst thing the U.S. government has done in the war on terror, but this is the issue, the set of issues that have the biggest traction and have created the most controversy because of these very phenomena. Just a few more things to mention in terms of some of the issues. Because of the nature of the law on torture, it's considered not only that it's considered a crime everywhere, although it's practiced commonly, but it is regarded as a crime. It's considered one of the core international crimes. And more importantly, I think, it attaches something called universal jurisdiction, which means that it's considered such an obvious and heinous crime that anybody who perpetrates or abets torture can technically be prosecuted anywhere. So if, for example, the perpetrator of torture is not prosecuted in his or her own country, he or she can be prosecuted in any other country. And I'm going to come back to that with my sort of politically controversial punchline to today's talk. But just to note that, torture is one of those things that really can be prosecuted anywhere. Now, the issue of torture in practice, why would any government, or certainly why would democratic governments, Israel in my earlier research experience in the United States, why would governments engage in torture, and how do they engage in torture? Well, the why question, I think, is one that is very interesting, but revealing about some of the things about members of our government. After 9/11, Dick Cheney and other officials basically made the argument that sort of anything goes now, that we lack intelligence about Al-Qaeda and anything goes, and these horrible, heinous people who are responsible for the horrific terrorist acts have no right not to be tortured, and so anything we do to them is permissible and tolerable, and was the idea that torture works. In a sense, it was this desperation and also this disregard for the laws themselves. So there was this notion that torture works and therefore is necessary, and that gets built into U.S. policy from the immediate aftermath of 9/11. But also if one thinks about how torture is utilized, just to go back and put it into a larger context, and I saw these changes myself in the context of Israel-Palestine between the late 1980s and the late 1990s. Many states now, and certainly those states that will feel accountable to their own citizens or accountable to international opinion, will no longer engage in the kinds of interrogation tactics or torture that leave physical marks. Right? Because of the fact that there are human rights organizations out there, that governments, if they are going to engage in torture, they need to engage in be able to have deniability. And so the kinds of torture that would have characterized earlier periods, even literally up until the late 1980s, including electric shocks and cigarette burnings and the breaking of bones, etc., those things have fallen greatly out of favor in no small part because of the fact that they are crimes, and the physical kinds of torture leave marks that can actually constitute the basis for prosecuting people. But psychological torture, which arguably can be worse than physical torture. Protracted sleep deprivation, stress positions where people are held in painful positions, sensory deprivation or sensory overload. Many of these things really are, in some ways worse on the people who are subjected to them, but they don't leave marks. And because of the way in which they're talked about and thought about, many people who have never experienced these things don't see them as torture. So, for example, Donald Rumsfeld would argue when, saying, how prisoners would be kept standing or subjected to isolation, sort of minimizing it, like, so what, we keep people awake, or so what, somebody stands. I stand for 8 hours a day at my working desk. That was, Donald Rumsfeld had written that in a note when somebody was saying the prisoners should only be made to stand for 4 hours a day. But the issues, and in a sense, are, and just to give you the words of a Palestinian who I had interviewed some years ago, talking about in the Israeli-Palestinian context, how the shift from the late 80s into the 90s, where he had been arrested in the late 80s and was beaten, by interrogators, and by the 90s it was all this kind of psychological stuff. And one thing he said, which I think is generally, carries across cultures and periods, is that he said, when you're beating the body, or when your body is being attacked, at least your mind can block it out. But when your mind itself is the target, there's nothing to protect you. And in some ways, it's a much more intense thing. But that is exactly what has been utilized, partially for deniability and partially for the presumption that this is a better and more effective way of breaking people. And Alfred McCoy, who was here last week and who has a brilliant book that sort of analyzes the history of psychological torture, goes into that in general. So just very, very briefly, in the few moments that I would take left, is to talk about my own work now on torture and the war on terror. I mean, I, like many people, have been writing about the issue and sort of what's been going on in the United States. But I would say, coming back to a point I made earlier, that it really is one of the major crises that this country is facing for several reasons. I mean, one, it's a sort of a controversy that simply will not go away. But also the kinds of things that the government, first the executive branch, secretly instituted in terms of interpreting the law or making arguments that the law doesn't actually apply in certain ways, that the president has constitutional power to disregard federal torture laws and so on. I mean, that was a crisis in some ways for the separation of powers. But it's also been an ongoing crisis because it's been, the policies towards prisoners have been very, very politicized, like everything in this country in terms of partisan politics. And in October of 2006, before the elections, Congress, the last Congress, passed the Military Commissions Act, which essentially, just to be very brief about it, was giving President Bush, then the Republican majority in Congress, was giving President Bush what he wanted, which was essentially overturning the Supreme Court ruling in the Hamdan case of June 2006. The Hamdan case was a landmark Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court had basically just cut the rug out from all kinds of illegal or unlawful policies instituted by the Bush administration, including holding prisoners incommunicado for protracted period, denying them habeas corpus, permitting tortured testimony in their prosecution, and so on and so forth. Congress, in the lead up to the election, basically gave President Bush what he wanted, which is the Military Commissions Act. And it's a scandalous act. But what I would just say about my own research over the last couple of years, first, slowly, when the executive branch was instituting a number of policies secretly, and then after the publication of the Abu Ghraib photos in April of 2004, and the following of the declassification of many of the so-called torture memos, as more and more of the public became aware of it, the people who've really been on the forefront of this for good reason, I mean, this is a legal issue, are lawyers. Now, I'm often accused by my friends of, sort of elevating lawyers to a high position, and I will concede that point absolutely. I love lawyers, especially lawyers who are interested in torture. But it's really been a number of lawyers, I mean hundreds of lawyers, who have come out, and because of the complexity of the issue, interpreting the Constitution, interpreting the applicability of the Geneva Conventions, et cetera, it is a specialized kind of field. But we've seen corporate lawyers, death penalty lawyers, military lawyers, private lawyers, gas and oil lawyers, coming together, and the way I would characterize it is forming very strange bedfellow alliances to do what they've been doing in a multitude of ways, defending people in Guantanamo, litigating various cases on behalf of victims, and so on. Many of these lawyers who I've interviewed would say that what they're doing is trying to defend the rule of law from the predations of a radical right-wing, members of the current administration. But what I would say in thinking about all of these issues in the larger scheme of things is that because The right not to be tortured is the commonest and the most basic, almost the humanitarian baseline of rights. What they are really doing, in my opinion, is trying to defend the very principle of humanity, which is really under assault in this period. I just want to just sort of end on a controversial note. It's always been the question of whether human rights law can function as law, and whether we can really use law. Again, as I said, the law will not set you free, and what's interesting about the law is the way people use it, the way people understand it or resist it, etc. But one of the ways I think that we should think about the law, human rights law, is thinking about what makes law. And in my opinion, law, when law works, it's violent. There's something called the violence of law. And so in general, I would say when I think about human rights, I don't take the soft, fuzzy approach to human rights. Let's help people. It's nice to help people. I personally am interested in hurting people, like hurting people who hurt people. And the law on torture actually provides the basis for hurting those who hurt people, to prosecute people, because torture is a crime and they can be prosecuted. If they can't be prosecuted in this country, they can be prosecuted in other countries. And there's an effort now to bring Donald Rumsfeld and other perpetrators and abettors of torture to justice in Germany. Whether that will go anywhere, remains to be seen. But finally, this is my controversial statement. In the United States, we very much, unlike many of our allies, we have a very tough on crime kind of a discourse, death penalty, a merciless approach. And I'm sure Kaya and others will talk about this. There's many reasons to be critical of this for the effects on racial and ethnic and minorities and lower classes, etc. But I would say also that if in this moment we have a tough on crime discourse and it appeals to a lot of people, we should take that tough on crime discourse and get tough on crime, the crime of torture, and demand not simply investigations, but the actual prosecution in U.S. courts of Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Alberto Gonzalez, and others who have brought disgrace to this country and menaced the very concept of humanity.
Before I offer some words on the topic of teaching in and about prisons, I ask that you join me in a brief moment of silence, to be still and quiet together, mindful of the individual lives that are at stake in much of the work that we do. Let us be aware of silences that deafen, legacies of silencing, and the power of the human voice. Please join me. Thank you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I am grateful to all of the organizers and to each of you for the opportunity to be among you. I begin my presentation today with a passage from my notes while a student intern in college at Greenhaven, a maximum security prison in upstate New York, because I believe it provides a powerful metaphor for the contemporary penal system in the United States. All too often, people enter prison when all other social institutions have failed them. They enter in the name of justice and usually end up with even deeper wounds. Julio had a thick scar on his cheek. He touched it with his fingertips and told me it came from cutting himself with a razor blade. I noticed his facial hair had not yet started to grow. He told me he was 16 years old when he entered a bodega with the intention to steal money from the cash register. He explained that he had pushed one fist through the inside of his sweatshirt pocket to make it look like he had a gun. To protect himself, the manager of the bodega drew his own weapon, which was real, and in a blink, another person was killed. Julio was convicted of a felony B murder and entered prison with a 25-year to life sentence. First he was stripped, next his body was sprayed with chemicals to kill any possible lice. Finally he was hosed down and forced to shave his face and skull. He did not know how to use a razor. He said he was so scared that his hand trembled as he held the blade, and before he realized it, he had cut deep into his own flesh. That's how Julio got the scar on his face. Then he was shackled and cuffed. In my estimation, there is no more pressing human rights issue, no more urgent spiritual crossroads or threat to democracy than the current penal crisis. It is a crisis that constitutes a form of apartheid, an institutionalized apartheid that is social, economic, and racial. It is a crisis that imposes itself, as Hazel Carby reminds us, on black and brown bodies in poor urban areas, on mothers, on fathers, and children. It is a crisis that is not popular to expose. My attention to the everyday violence that is afflicted on real bodies signals the need for healing deep wounds and relates directly to the critical issue of torture. It was 1993 when I first walked into Greenhaven as a student intern at Vassar College. I remember seeing the sunlight refract off of the steel shackles around a man's ankles. Something about that vision temporarily blinded me, and as if through some holy conversation, the course of my life was altered. Initially inspired by one professor, Larry Mamiya, I have worked over the last 14 years with various communities on the inside, spanning 12 prisons in 4 states. I always tremble when I walk into a prison. Even after teaching college courses inside Sing Sing for over a year, I quake a little bit as I walk through the first metal detector. I tremble because the mental distress of affliction is felt in the body. I tremble because it is a shameful environment. It is shameful to be present, and it is shameful to walk away. Whether the 6 by 8 foot cells with no windows that house grown women and men for 20 hours a day are in New York or California, whether the guards bring lessons of force and humiliation home to their children in Georgia or Massachusetts, the suffering is the same. 2/3 of all people entering prison have less than a 9th grade education, earned less than $2,000 in the year prior to their incarceration, and are being sentenced for nonviolent, drug-related offenses, which one could argue pose minimal threat to public safety. Although the crime rate has remained relatively constant over the last 30 years, the prison population has increased by more than 900%. And we workers pay taxes to fund abysmal recidivism rates. Each prison is an industry unto itself, with its own products, rules, and webs of influence. Inside, innumerable people feel failed by the justice, failed by the rhetoric about freedom, safety, and individual rights. The capital, an estimated $60 billion per year, and the uncalculated human cost of our revolving law enforcement system is staggering and unprecedented. It bears repeating that we are living in a crisis. There are close to 9 million people under the control of the U.S. punishment system or who work in the criminal punishment sector. By the punishment sector, I mean those who are behind bars and those who work in law enforcement. It has become evident that the keeper and the kept all too often come from similar socioeconomic communities, if not the same families. One could make the same case for our young soldiers, because in particular neighborhoods, many of our teenagers believe that they have only 2 options in life: prison or the military. In this way, we profoundly misunderstand the relationship between the punishment sector and the military-industrial complex when we assume that the guards and the soldiers are the other. To forget that these officers are our children, born into a gun culture, into a rape culture that is afflicted by a spirit of punishment and addicted to the myth of redemptive violence, is to betray ourselves. Although we tend to refer to the current penal crisis in abstract terms, the prison industry, structural racism, institutional violence, I have come to believe that The crisis is not captured with statistics or charts that outline disenfranchisement, can you hear me? Poverty and the devastation of particular communities. Remember Julio's scar and the humiliation of routine cavity searches, or what may be more aptly called state-sanctioned sexual assault. Our current penal catastrophe can only begin to be communicated by actually going inside a penal institution and listening to those who are intimate with the pain and struggle of incarceration. The smell of fear, the waste of human resources, and the interminable, mind-shattering noise are stark reminders that this crisis is neither theoretical nor new. The historical context of chattel slavery is vital to understanding the distinctly American methods of torture. Whether it is the charred bodies on lynching postcards from the 19th century or current no-touch terror tactics of psychological warfare perfected by the CIA, arbitrary brutality is the warp and woof of our legal framework. Furthermore, our culture is embedded with theological ideas about evil, otherness, and what constitutes humanity. The concepts of who is the enemy and who needs to be saved, and these ideas precede any written law on this soil. For the last 3 years, I have offered a course called From Plantations to Prisons, an overview of the U.S. penal system to students here at UCSB. 2 weeks ago, 20 students joined me for a tour of the Santa Barbara County Jail. When the commander unlocked the one empty safety cell, we were overwhelmed by the sight and smell of feces smeared all over the walls. Talk about euphemisms and discourses that normalize and legitimize torture. If you were stripped naked by a peace officer and locked in a safety cell with nothing else but rubber walls and a grate in the floor for you to relieve yourself, what would you do? It is a testament to the human spirit that we resist. We resist torture with whatever resources we have. And torture is not limited to Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, or extraordinary rendition. It is right here on Calle Real. At one point during a tour at Lancaster Prison, the lieutenant asked my students and me to stop walking and wait with our backs against the wall of a building. Inside, we soon learned, were hundreds of makeshift beds, 3 levels high, 10 rows across, and 30 rows deep on a gymnasium floor. The cots were necessary to house the men who had been transferred from the LA County Jail due to unprecedented overcrowding. So as we waited in the desert heat, one by one, the men from the county jail, the men who could not afford bail and have yet to be tried by a court of law, the men who have neither been convicted nor sentenced, exited the building in their underwear. One by one, they stepped onto the ground before us, stood on their tiptoes, while 2 guards inspected their bodies for contraband. Ranging in ages, I would guess, from 17 to 70, they pulled their underwear away from their bodies in the front, pulled their underwear open in the back, and then were handed their orange state uniform jumpsuit to put on before entering the yard. In your presence, I ask myself, how am I to make sense of standing there in the sunshine with my students, backs against the wall, as men were strip searched in front of us? What does it mean to watch as another person is dehumanized and say nothing, do nothing? What are the ethics of my whiting out the black studies on the letterhead I faxed to penal institutions to identify with the University of California and not ethnic studies, so as to be in a more likely position to provide the opportunity for my students to witness and experience being, albeit briefly, in a California carceral institution in 2007. Why did I begin this afternoon with a moment of silence? I believe the classroom is a sacred space. Pedagogy is embodied, and learning communities are places in which the individual is able to recognize injuries and transmute fractures into wholeness. As Oscar Romero reminds us, this is what we are about. We plant seeds that one day will grow. We water seeds already planted, knowing that they hold future promise. For me, education is a practice for humanity. I understand humanity as that which asserts itself as well as that which can be denied. In this way, humanity is both indestructible and vulnerable. It can be violated by an other. Still, by doing the painful work of breaking through one's own propensity to think and feel in terms of the other, whether it is in relation to the CIA or the so-called red states, by being vulnerable, we engender the kind of communities essential to make social change. To name pain as pain, to speak directly to the pain within, the pain caused by all forms of domination, to create theory from a location of struggle and expose one's own wounds in the act of teaching engenders a powerful solidarity and has radical implications for education. The juxtaposition of the sunlight and the shackles, in my mind, symbolizes soul-stirring questions. How is human life affirmed despite structures that work to annihilate the human spirit and fetter the human body? In what ways is our integrity revealed even as it is subverted? What is valuable about the humanization that occurs in spite of the totalizing institution of prison, like the shoots of plants that burst through cracks in the concrete? To my knowledge, there are forces of injustice that flow within us and among us. There is violence in our very hearts and homes. In conclusion, how can we, as students, teachers, radical activists, intellectuals, how can we avoid embodying the same tone of moral condemnation that we seek to destroy? When our indictment has no invitation, when we denounce the past and provide no alternative future, we fail. When our research betrays Terence's wisdom, Terence, an African man born in 154 BCE, enslaved by the Romans to then become the most popular playwright in Rome, wrote, "I am human, and nothing human is alien to me." When we are unwilling to recognize the truth that we are human and nothing human is alien to us, when we are loath to even envision the possibilities of particular alliances, we fail the intention of our collective work for social justice. Let us question how each of us perpetuates injustice and look for complexity and contradiction. I think of the prison guard trying to feed her family. Let us remain focused on who the power elite is and join forces. Let us not be hesitant in our visions. Imagine if students joined with professors, seminaries with law schools, atheists with Muslims, agnostics with Christians, prison guard unions with formerly incarcerated people, multinational corporations with grassroots organizers, and we work to amend the 13th Amendment of our Constitution, which abolishes slavery except if you've been duly convicted of a crime. Can we even future a day when slavery and involuntary servitude are no longer legal with no exceptions? Are we ready to shed the logic that our oath to safeguard makes it okay to do harm? Ella Baker reminds us the struggle is eternal. The tribe increases, somebody else carries on. And as my grandmother begins and ends all conversations these days, she's 95. God blesses you. Thank you.
It's a great source of pride for me to be part of this program. I think it's one of the finest initiatives that has occurred during my long academic career, and it is what a serious university needs to do, to look, to explore as deeply as it can the issues that afflict a society as ours is being afflicted by this issue of torture occurring as we speak. I am a lawyer and not ready to glorify lawyers to the extent of that Lisa did. And I would say that the depth of the torture crisis is revealed by the phrase even lawyers. Even lawyers are dislodged from their normal habitats and are responding to this radical circumstance of manifested torture. See, what is, I think, distinctive in this period is the shamelessness with which the torture practices have been justified and euphemized and hidden, attempted to mess with our minds so that we would somehow feel that we were entitled to torture. And that has sufficiently activated a portion of the elite legal community, and we can be grateful for that, and maybe that qualifies the Shakespearean injunction, kill the lawyers first. And he had a point, of course. But I thought in trying to come to grips with the challenge of this topic, I felt it was necessary to engage in a bit of self-conscious interrogating myself as to why I have had such a strong pull toward human rights throughout my academic career. And the best I could do was to trace it back to a pre-political roots that had to do with growing up in New York City and being a Dodger fan, that is, being for the underdog team rather than being for the Yankees, the team of the rich and the successful, the team that was winning all the time. And I think that there is something about that sense of identification with victimized peoples that comes out of a probably rather mysterious disposition to make that choice of the being identifying with the victims and the vulnerable. And it, I believe, has led to my own critical orientation toward things that the United States government has done and that Israel has done, which reflect my American identity and my Jewish background, in the sense that it is not only that one identifies with the victim, but also one realizes that one's part of the perpetrator. One has an affinity with the perpetrator. I think that's part of what was so beautifully expressed by Kaya. And in that sense, I was very much affected by my involvement in opposition to the Vietnam War. Initially, as an abstract intellectual, political scientist, international law person, but much more deeply when I had the opportunity to go to North Vietnam during the war and experience the war from the perspective of those being victimized, those that were unconditionally vulnerable in that war, that especially in North Vietnam. And I had somewhat the same experience when I had, somewhat later, had this existential connection with the Palestinians. And it made me come to a realization that these kinds of high-tech, one-sided, violent struggles were really collective metaphors of torture. Because if you think about it, what torture in its essence consists of is the deployment of violence against the utterly helpless that has no capacity for meaningful retaliation. It is the pain, the infliction of pain as a free good, so to speak, because it can't be in any no cost can be exacted on the torturer is both psychologically and in most other respects enjoys a radical condition of impunity. And it is that radical condition of impunity that I think touches the evil of the political perpetrator, those that rationalize the practices, and the actual physical agents of torture are instruments of state power and are themselves being victimized and dehumanized in this way, in a way that they probably have a greater degree of consciousness about than the Rumsfelds, Cheneys, and Bushes do. But the pedagogical point that I'm trying to make, and I think all of us have made it in different ways, is that to learn about human rights, you need experience. You need the social science and legal analysis may be useful, but they're not substitutes for the touching the raw nerve of human suffering. And it is that's what was so powerful for me about being in North Vietnam during the war while it was being bombed, or being in the Palestinian territories, particularly Gaza. It was that sense of where intellectual distance is no longer possible, where you lose that distance. And I think one of the real contributions of this program is the recognition that the humanities can not be a substitute for the experience, but they can bring us closer to that raw nerve of suffering. And I felt, for instance, when I read Toni Morrison's Beloved, that it was the first time I understood racism in America, or what African Americans experienced. I had lived, of course, all my life among African Americans, among races. I was a friend of Cornel West and others, and but that novel somehow penetrated to a level of consciousness that these other ways of knowing hadn't done. And I just read a book recently, a novelistic account of a boy in Sudan who was victimized by the various atrocities taking place there. I recommend it strongly, called has a strange title, What is the What, by Dave Eggers. It's a very powerful, and you cannot read such an account without a empathetic feeling that to be human, you need to take suffering seriously. And in that for me, that's the ethical foundation of my own engagement with this subject matter. And I just want to say a couple of other things. I think that one of the other aspects of torture and of human rights more generally is that it has a perverse connection with our fascination with limits and exceeding limits. The positive fascination is often associated with those that climb the highest mountain, those that risk climbing Mount Everest or exploring the interior of Antarctica. But in some way, this extension of behavior beyond the limits of the possible is what I think both is so disturbing about torture, because it seems as though it's an enactment of what I would call the politics of impossibility, that human beings shouldn't be capable of doing this, and therefore the capacity to do it, as is the case with genocide and collective crimes against humanity, the fact that there is this human capability both enlarges and sabotages our understanding of what it is to be human, and is both, I think, threatening and, in a very deep sense, challenging. And of course, it's one of the biblical themes connected with the Tower of Babel. Going beyond, what happens to humanity when it surpasses permissible limits? See, in a way, that's the issue here. What is going to happen to us when we pass these permissible limits? And I would say not only torture, the Abu Ghraib style of torture, but also the way we wage war, the way we bomb from high altitudes against defenseless populations. The metaphor that originally led me to think of that as torture is not just a metaphor. It expresses this one-sided characteristic of inflicting severe pain in a situation where there's no reciprocity, where there's no return. So let me just end by saying that one of the comforting or consoling aspects of this subject matter is the degree to which I think young people at this time in our history have shifted the locus of their idealism in the direction of human rights. It's a generation ago, when I was teaching in the East, it was a very marginal subject matter within the university. And the more idealistic students were drawn to issues concerning the United Nations or concerning disarmament or issues associated with war and peace. And of course, these are still extremely important, but I think that one of the encouraging developments is this shift of moral consciousness, or the center of moral gravity, in the direction of taking suffering seriously, which, as I've been trying to say, seems to me to be the essence of our concern with human rights. Thank you very much.
Teaching, torture, and the future. I want to begin addressing the question of torture in the future by turning first to the past and briefly analyzing changes in the reception of my American students to questions of the representation of torture in South African literature. I first noticed the uncanny effect of South African literature upon my students while teaching an honors seminar on the literature of late and post-apartheid at the University of Colorado in 1999. South African literature was staged as something at once familiar and utterly other. While aspects of segregation and racial prejudice were recorded as a familiar, if past, element of the American experience, torture and the absolute degradation of the racial other was conceived as something radically alien and outside the ambit of contemporary American consciousness. One of my students, a Vietnam veteran who was actually in charge of the interrogation of North Vietnamese prisoners during the war, became increasingly agitated and began deriding accounts of torture in J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, as foolish, and strongly denied that any aspect of torture or interrogation could be learnt from the text. I say that South African literature was staged by my students as simultaneously familiar and utterly other, but I do not want to suggest that their response was simply inauthentic or one given in bad faith. There was something deeply shocking and genuinely dislocating for them in reading accounts of torture in Ankie Krog's Country of My Skull and, excuse me, and in watching the anguished testimony of victims before the TRC. Torture seemed to present a kind of psychic vanishing point or limit that distinguished the abjection in some South African texts as radically inassimilable. Discoursing on this limit taught us much about the ethics of reading and questions of witnessing and testimony. Previously in the seminar, we had learnt to regard local knowledge, Afrikaans or African words, as textual markers of difference that could not simply be translated away. Torture posed stronger, more insistent ethical limits. I want to contrast that seminar with the change that confronted a similar seminar that I taught at Connecticut College in 2003. America was now gripped by the war on terror, and while questions of responsibility in the representation of torture still imposed ethical limits, Waiting for the Barbarians was now read by some of my more activist students in terms of the Patriot Act and the interrogation of prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. The political activism that had been so much part of the teaching of South African literature during the apartheid years now, excuse me, sorry, I have a cold, now made its return to the classroom. During one particularly contentious class session, students from my seminar contended with visiting parents who had brought their children to Connecticut College as prospective future students. I want to speak of one further return of the repressed and one further display of the uncanniness of South African literature in the American context. In the spring of 2004, I was teaching a seminar entitled J.M. Coetzee and the Ethics of the Other. We were caught up in examining the historical context of the hidden torture out of which Waiting for the Barbarians emerged, and in questioning what role the revelations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission would play in coding the text's future reception. Despite the changes wrought by the war on terror, my American students strongly rejected any possibility of hidden torture sanctioned by American officials. The revelations of torture and abuse of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison now erupted into the space of the seminar with the same kind of shock and dislocation that the revelations of the TRC had earlier produced. The effect for me was one of the uncanny in the Freudian sense of something once familiar that has been displaced and now returns. The effect upon my students was to shift problems of torture in South African literature from the realm of the purely other to a much more nuanced and somber reading of the war on terror. So what changes have the recent revelations of government renditions made to my contemporary seminars at UCSB? Ironically, what was previously coded as radically inassimilable and outside of any possible official US sanction is now treated as a familiar and legally condoned practice. The specificity of torture in the context of apartheid now threatens to become subsumed in a generalized excess of universal torture practiced in secret CIA-sanctioned black sites or torture chambers. But it has been my experience that reading or watching TRC accounts of the testimony of victims still carries with it the power to haunt and shock our ethical conscience. In fact, precisely because it is impossible to justify the state of emergency proclaimed by the apartheid government and the use of torture as a weapon that kept apartheid in power during the state of emergency, one of the effects of teaching torture in the context of apartheid is that it allows us to puncture the state of exception established by the sovereign powers of the Bush administration. Ironically, then, one of the uses of South African torture studies in America is to defamiliarize torture and resituate it as unmitigated atrocity and make indefensible this practice of torture, which is increasingly acknowledged as taking place, but which is increasingly unthought and even disavowed. So dislocating, in fact, is the witnessing of the anguished accounts of victims that it is sometimes difficult for students to speak afterwards. And this comes not out of any unwillingness to think or engage questions, but because some slight tremor of the trauma of torture has passed through our seminar. At such times, I've learnt the importance of leaving things suspended in a still silence that allows for a working through. This leads to one of the ethical dilemmas in the teaching of torture. What of those students who refuse to read the literature of atrocity, who refuse to watch the testimonies because it is too much for them, or because they fear it is too much for them? By what right can the teacher of torture compel the student's engagement and not risk becoming oneself guilty of harming, of participating in the subtle voyeuristic pleasures that replicates, in however minor a way, the position occupied by the torturer? But by what right does one acquiesce in the refusal to see what is being done in your name? One way into this dilemma is to demonstrate to wary students that a version of this problem already lies at the heart of the question of the representation of torture itself. Speaking of the writing of torture, Coetzee has one of his characters, Elizabeth Costello, say, "This is my thesis today, that certain things are not good to read or write. To put it another way, I take seriously the claim that the artist risks a great deal by venturing into forbidden places, risks specifically himself, risks perhaps all." Into the Dark Chamber, an essay on the perils of writing torture, Coetzee speaks of the novelist as positioned before the dark chamber, forbidden to enter, and who, as a result of this insufferable ban, recreates the scene he or she is forbidden to see. One of the dangers of the torture chamber is that it lures the writer into a complicit rendering and laying bare the obscene act of torture. For the writer, Coetzee claims, the deeper problem is not to allow himself to be impaled on that dilemma proposed by the state, namely either to ignore its obscenities or else to produce them, representations of them. The true challenge is how not to play the game by the rules of the state, how to establish one's own authority, how to imagine torture and death on one's own terms. Close quote. The problem of the writer establishing his or her ethical authority may prove more intractable than Coetzee allows. However, and this is because the fate of a text slips from the hand of the author to a very uncertain reception. Or to put this more specifically, the reception of a text, especially a text that deals in torture, is partly conditioned by future events, future instances or acts of torture. Although Waiting for the Barbarians, for example, emerges out of the specific historical context of late apartheid and bears a specific historical relation to the torture and murder of Steve Biko, the reception of the text has been profoundly altered by the subsequent revelations during the TRC of future acts of torture. Agonized accounts of torture suffered at the hands of the apartheid security police have erupted into the field of the text's reception, pulled by the traumatic talk of Coetzee's text in the accrual of a spectacular power. But it is not only the stories of torture in South Africa that have been drawn into the field of the text's future reception. The story of torture at Abu Ghraib has added to this accrual of spectacular horror. Students often point out to me the uncanny correspondence between the hooded magistrate dressed in a woman's frock and hung by his arms so that he can feel a terrible tearing in his shoulders as though whole sheets of muscle are giving way, and the infamous photograph of the hooded and frocked figure in Abu Ghraib prison, arms outstretched and electric wires trailing from his fingers. It seems to me this is precisely illustrative of the trap that is posed by the problem of the writing of torture that even so ethical a text as Barbarians can fall prey to. Speaking of terror, but the same holds true for torture, Jacques Derrida has remarked, quote, "There is traumatism with no possible work of mourning when evil comes from the possibility to come from the worst. From the repetition to come, though worse, traumatism is produced by the future, by the to come, by the threat of the worst to come, rather than by an aggression that is over and done with." The deconstruction of the text's will to power over future torture may always be part of our work of critique. I want to close by noting one further ironic turn in the story of torture and reception. It seems that the story of torture in America is likely to play some role in coding the future of South African torture studies. Thank you.
I'm just wondering whether, in terms of describing the reasons for torture in Lisa's presentation, whether there's something else that needs to be added, which is not only the effect of possibly getting information and all this, and also brutalizing the victim, but also terrorizing the entire population, because as much as there's an attempt to keep torture deniable, people know that it's going on, and therefore can be constrained because of it.
Thank you. I think that's a very relevant and important point, especially in contexts. Well, let me just say very briefly that the sort of general reasons why torture occurs or even has occurred historically. One of them, there's penal torture, which is actually hurting people purposely as punishment, judicial torture, which is to torture people for confessions, torture for intelligence information, and then I think the one that you're mentioning, which can also be linked to any of these, but torturing individuals in order to terrorize a larger population. So it's one manifestation of state terror. And in that sense, I think that it applies in particular to contexts of war, and particularly certain kinds of contexts of war, colonial wars or sort of wars to put down anti-colonial resistance, or civil wars. The United States, for example, just to think about what happened in Iraq, when, after George Bush had famously stood up and said mission accomplished in May of 2003, and then, sort of the mission seemed to, fall increasingly apart very quickly by the summer. What was going on in Iraq was a crisis in Washington, for Washington people. And so I don't know that what was happening just in that context was that thousands of Iraqis were just being swept up with absolutely no suspicion that they knew anything. It was simply the fact that the Americans had absolutely no intelligence and had no idea what they were doing and couldn't, they couldn't comprehend that, disbanding the entire Ba'ath Party might have been, an inapt thing to do. But I mean, in a sense, one could say that maybe the U.S. wasn't intentionally terrorizing the population, but certainly had that effect. Whereas in other contexts, South Africa and elsewhere, the torture of some to terrorize the many. So we can think about also it requires us to look back at the interests of the perpetrators and those who, authorize that policy.
What are the what are the specific things that people in the audience can do regarding torture? I understand to the extent that I can the global implications of torture, but what can a talk like this do in terms of furthering action? Where are the organizations, or what tangible information is there for people to take this information and make some change?
Well, I'll leave, maybe Kaya might respond to some of the domestic issues. I think there's many. As far as thinking about torture as an international crime and operating on the international level, certainly the first major human rights organizations, or the beginning of a human rights movement, was the creation of Amnesty International in 1961, and torture was the breakout issue. So one can really say that everything we know about human rights activism and a globalizing discourse starts in the early 60s with Amnesty, and Amnesty is obviously one of the major ways in which people can be informed and active on this issue. And we have, of course, an Amnesty chapter here at UCSB, as they have tens of thousands of them everywhere. The other major organizations, just to educate yourselves, Human Rights Watch, the ACLU, which has not historically gotten involved in international law, but did so after 9/11 because of the fact that the U.S. government has been violating both domestic and international laws. And the ACLU, as a litigation powerhouse, is something that's really interesting for people to find out about some of the court cases. And then Human Rights First. These are ways in which people can educate themselves. I think one of the things I maybe will respond or have a comment about Russell's point is, I think that people who don't know much about torture or other human rights violations should read, should be made to read, should look for those things that make you uncomfortable. Do not shy away from it. It is ugly, it's nasty, and that's exactly why you should immerse yourself in it. And so in some sense, I think that it's, as a starting point, just to read human rights reports. But maybe, Kai, you want to speak to what people can do vis-a-vis conditions in the U.S., punishment system, as you say.
Thank you for that question. I would say, aside from joining already existing organizations that are doing such powerful and needed work, we can begin to question ourselves, interrogate ourselves, as a few people said. And I think in some ways, because language is the meat for the ideas that we have and our deeds, we can, well, let's say I've been invited by people who have done, endured decades of incarceration, primarily in New York prisons, to consider and change the language we use. So rather than calling people, convict, parolee, super predator, welfare mother, inmate, say people who are currently incarcerated, people who are formerly incarcerated, because so much of what that I feel like psychologically we can sanction and talk theoretically about torture and prepare ourselves. It's almost as if we slip into the very the problem of forgetting that people are human by not referring to their humanity. So I think it's important to always signal people's humanity in the language we use. And I mean, there are that's my response for now.
In terms of reading, I want to recommend one book in particular. It's called Country of My Skull by Ankie Kroch. It's one of the most powerful texts that I've ever read, both intellectually and in terms of emotions, dealing with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings and the history of torture in South Africa. I suspect, or I hope, that at some point there will be a Truth Commission in America. Surely the events that have taken place in the past 3 years, 4 years in Iraq will warrant it.
Yes.
Truth, but I'm not sure reconciliation. I think I think one way of thinking about the issue that you pose is to ask, what does it mean at this point in your life and in history to be a good citizen? Human rights is really, in my view, about citizenship in a democratic society. And what you do is, of course, an intensely personal, what you do about that is intensely personal. But my own sense is that we are living in a period of increasing globalization where citizenship is increasingly to be in touch with the sorts of realities that we're talking about. You need to be a citizen without borders or beyond borders. That the tribalized citizenship that comes from nationalism is increasingly inconsistent with the well-being and even survival of the human species. And so, and especially those of us living in this most powerful and destructive country, we have to not think only as Americans, but we have to think as in a non-sentimental sense as to what does it mean to be a citizen of the world.
Well, first I wanted to thank all of you for very timely and provocative talks. It was really, really great. In the fall, I taught a writing class where I had a part of the class dealing with the question of torture. And out of that experience, a question I have for you is, how have you dealt with, well, defenders of torture, or students who are sort of actively voicing the other side of this question in such a way to respect their intellectual development and encourage them to keep growing and thinking, as well as maybe the students who are resistant to even engage the question?
Well, one of the ways I deal with this, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think it's a very important pedagogical question that comes up in many different areas. And I would be sure that many of my colleagues have lots of things to say about it. My personal way of dealing with it in general is know a hell of a lot about that which you don't like. I mean, really be able to speak with some very serious authority about the things you disagree with, as a general thing. And certainly in that level, being able to talk teach, talk, speak at length about what is being undertaken, what the law says and how it's being disregarded, how nothing of value is coming out of these coercive interrogations. I mean, right, that's also another thing that we need to be aware of. Is it's not contrary to government rhetoric that valuable intelligence is coming out. There may be valuable intelligence being gathered. There is absolutely no evidence that any of it ever has come out of the actual coercive interrogation. So to be able to know that and to talk about specific interrogations of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Abu Zubaydah, et cetera, those are issues, ways of dealing with these things. The other thing I would say, and again, this is something that I learned both in terms of my research on Israel-Palestine and now after 9/11, things that have surprised me, and I think at least position me as a teacher in an unusual, like not a predictably leftist kind of position. I mean, just to say about what's happened with 9/11 and my understanding of it, some of the people who I think have done the most heroic work in this particular context are people in the military, especially military lawyers. And looking at some of the military lawyers who have taken on the government and done so at the expense, on behalf of the most despised people in the context of this country and at the risk of their own, military careers, Charles Swift being one of them, and so on, and the kinds of alliances that developed between military lawyers and human rights lawyers against these radical right-wing civilians. That kind of discourse problematizes the old school, predictable left versus right things, and I think that's very important for people to understand the value that military people have played in, resisting the kind of illegal actions that the government is engaged in.
Just a further note, I agree with what Lisa has just said, but I would add that especially teaching sensitive subject matter of this sort makes it a very important part of the pedagogical experience is for the teacher to learn to listen. That listening is, creative listening seems to me to be acknowledging the dignity of the points of view that one doesn't share.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, I wanted to say.
After you.
Go ahead.
I'm recalling my being a student in my last graduate seminar, and I remember I formulated this thesis. I thought it was impeccable, clear like water, and it was about indicting the blood on the history of the Catholic Church and how our notions of evil and otherness inform penal policy, and I just felt like I was shining. And it was a seminar sitting in a circle, and the professor, who was a beloved mentor, looked at me and was quiet. And then he looked at me again and he said, "Kaya, you adopt the same tone of moral condemnation that you seek to destroy." And that's just, his words stuck with me, and I feel like that is so difficult to do in my own writing, in my own work, and in encouraging my students to think critically and resist, and to write clearly and passionately. And it speaks to, I think, your suggestion that we have clearly we have so much to learn from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but what would it look like? I was struck by the way you ended your presentation and I ended my presentation. I mean, really, really powerful, I think, and it speaks to the room for conversation in this area. I propose that we shed the logic that our oath to safeguard makes it okay to do harm, and you invite us to consider doing more harm to those who do harm. So I think that my son, my 4-year-old son yesterday, I was trying to explain to him why I wasn't really preferring the Disney texts, and it was particularly Lion King. Are you all familiar with Lion King? So I said, I thought that Scar was really mean, the uncle. And he said, "But Mama, he gets killed." And that myth, I would say, as a theologian, our religion, our culture in America, is that there is this myth of redemptive violence, that violence will redeem us. So what would that look like? What would that Truth and Reconciliation Commission look like in the American context, in terms of sanctioning harm or not?
I would just say that I've never really had much trouble teaching torture when it comes to issues of South African literature, right? Almost all, I would say all, and I've taught many classes, right? All of my American students see torture in the South African context as absolutely evil, right? Now, it's very difficult after seeing torture as being so evil in the South African context to then defend it in the American context. Much more difficult, right? Because, of course, there were many justifications for torture made by white South Africans, made by the apartheid government, right? The same sorts of justificatory explanations that we hear today. So that's one of the uses, that's one of the things that I gestured to in this paper. One of the uses of teaching torture in the South African context is it allows us to disrupt, right, this whole discourse of the legal defense of torture.